All right, everyone, welcome back. Today's deep dive, well, it's a tough one.
Yeah.
It's a really tough one. We're going to be looking at the 2021 Atlanta spa shootings,
hmm
March 16th, 2021,
hmm
when, these attacks happened across the Atlanta metropolitan area,
Yeah.
in Cherokee County and in Atlanta itself.
It's a day that I think a lot of us remember where we were when we heard about this.
Yeah.
And you know what the details were.
8 people killed, 1 injured.
Yeah.
And the person responsible, a 21-year-old named Robert Aaron Long, who was arrested
Right.
later that day.
Right.
So what we're going to try to do in this deep dive is really kind of break down like what happened,
Yeah.
what was said about why it happened, what maybe wasn't said about why it happened, talk about the victims and the legal proceedings that followed, and just kind of the reactions to this really horrific event. And we've pulled a number of sources to kind of help us parse through all this stuff.
Yeah.
It was really important to state right from the start
hmm
is that there were conflicting narratives, right? And we're going to be talking about a lot of this in detail, but
Yeah.
6 of the 8 people that were killed were of Asian descent, and that obviously sparked, this huge Stop Asian Hate movement and a lot of other.
Yeah. And that right there gets at just one of the many things that makes this particular case so difficult to really like fully comprehend and understand.
Right.
Because you have what seems like on the surface maybe a very clear motive, but then the deeper you go, the more complicated and intertwined with other things it gets.
Yeah, it's
I think, yeah.
there's a lot to unpack here for sure.
Yeah.
So why don't we start with kind of the events as they happened that day?
Okay.
So Long, he purchased a 9mm handgun
Yeah.
and ammunition legally in Holly Springs earlier that day around 2 p.m.
Right. And then he bought some bourbon.
Yeah.
Consumed that while he was driving.
Yeah.
And then we know from surveillance footage that he arrived at Young's Asian Massage, which is near Ackworth, Georgia. And he sat in his car in the parking lot for like an hour.
Wow.
And during that time, he loaded his gun.
Okay.
And then he entered the spa at around 3:38 p.m. Eastern time.
So not like he just, rushed in
No.
and started doing this horrible thing. Like he was there for a while. He was inside for over an hour.
Right.
He paid for a service, and that service concluded around 4:45.
Hmm.
Then he went to the restroom in the back of the building,
Yeah.
and there was even like a customer who arrived around 4:40
Right.
who said like everything seemed totally normal.
Yeah.
You know.
It's really chilling when you think about it, because it just, to think that someone can just be, amongst people,
Yeah.
going about their day and all the while have this horrific plan in their mind. It's really unnerving.
So yeah, I mean, and it's important, I think, to kind of lay that out so people understand that, this wasn't just like
Right.
a quick thing.
No, it was
So
calculated.
calculated.
Yeah.
So after he leaves the restroom, things changed obviously.
Yes.
And very quickly. So his first victim was Paul Andre Michels, who was shot and killed in the back of the building.
Right.
And then moving toward the front of the spa, he shot and killed Daryu Feng and Xiaoji Tan in separate rooms.
And he shot all 3 of them in the head?
Yeah.
Like execution style?
It was brutal.
Yeah.
There was also a man in another room who was injured. And then Delana Ashley Yan Gonzalez.
Mm-hmm.
She was a customer, and she was fatally shot in the torso while hiding.
Right.
And her husband was in another room at the time,
Yeah.
getting a service. Just awful to even think about.
It really is. I mean, just the terror of those moments,
Yeah.
to know that something like that is happening and to be, basically trapped.
Yeah.
It's just, it's hard to even fathom.
Yeah. And one of the things I remember reading about, and we have these sources in these accounts, and I think it's important to like hear what people went through.
Oh, absolutely.
And this one customer survived being shot.
Wow.
And he said the gunman just walked in and started shooting.
Hmm.
And so he threw himself on the floor and begged for his life.
Oh my God.
And the gunman told him to look up and then shot him in the face.
Oh my God. So, I mean, it's just pure evil.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to hear these things, but I think it's important to, understand the level of
the gravity of weapons.
Yeah, the gravity of this event.
Yeah.
So, the first 911 calls came in at 4:54 p.m. to the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office.
Okay.
And the police, they arrived really quickly after Long had left the scene, and they found 2 people dead and 3 wounded. But as we said, 2 of the people who were wounded later died.
Right.
So we've got this horrific sequence of events that has unfolded in Cherokee County.
Right.
Um, but then about 30 miles away in Atlanta, around 5:47 p.m., the Atlanta Police Department responded to a reported robbery at Gold Massage Spa on Piedmont Road.
And there they found 3 women dead from gunshot wounds.
Yeah.
And then while the officers were there, they got another report of a shooting, this time across the street at aromatherapy spa.
Wow.
And there they found a 4th woman dead from a gunshot wound as well.
So we have a total of 7 victims at this point.
Right.
Um,
And it's chilling again, to think that 3 of the 4 victims at these 2 locations in Atlanta were also shot in the head.
Gross.
It's like the same MO. It's
Yeah.
very clearly the same person.
right.
And we also have accounts from employees at Gold Spa who survived this.
Yeah.
They said that they heard these ticking sounds, which of course turned out to be gunfire,
Right.
and they hid behind furniture and they were shot at, but luckily they weren't hit.
Right.
And they said that the gunman didn't say anything and that he actually locked the front and back doors of the spa.
Wow.
So, that's another detail that just adds to this just really eerie and just, disturbing nature of this whole thing.
Yeah, so we've got this, obviously there's a lot of chaos going on at this point.
Of course.
But there's a report from a Korean newspaper, the Chosun Ilbo,
Okay.
that cites an employee at Gold Spa who said that the shooter said, "I'm going to kill all Asians."
Right, but I think it's important to point out here that this quote, the veracity of this quote has been questioned
Okay.
by some people.
Okay.
There's a later report that suggests that a taxi driver overheard this
Okay.
from a business manager who claimed that a police officer had told them.
Got it.
So it's a little bit like a game of telephone here, where the source of that quote is a little bit muddled.
Okay.
So it's unclear whether or not those were his exact words.
Right.
But I mean, regardless of whether those were his exact words, the
Mhm.
fact that that is even a possibility,
Right.
I think speaks volumes
Right.
about the nature of this crime.
Okay. So there's also an eyewitness account from the aromatherapy spa shooting
Okay.
that says that the worker who opened the door was shot, but then the attacker fled without going any further inside.
Right.
And the prosecutor believes that the gun might have malfunctioned at that point, which could have prevented further casualties.
Yeah. That's a really grim thought.
Yeah, it is. But it's,
But it's a possibility.
Yeah.
That we have to, consider.
it is what it is. So at this point, obviously, the Atlanta Police Department, they realized the similarities
Right.
between these shootings and the one in Cherokee County.
Yeah.
And they dispatched patrols to other similar businesses in the area.
Right.
And the FBI joins the investigation at this point.
Okay. So they were able to apprehend Long relatively quickly after Cherokee County Police released the surveillance footage
Okay.
from Young's Asian Massage, and Long's parents, they recognized him.
Oh, wow.
And so while they were being interviewed by law enforcement, they told police that their son's Hyundai Tucson had a tracking device on it. So using that information and surveillance footage of his car at both crime scenes,
Yeah.
law enforcement was able to track Long as he drove south.
Okay.
And he was eventually caught in Crisp County, which is about 150 miles south of Atlanta, around 8:30 p.m. And the Georgia State Patrol used a PIT maneuver to stop his vehicle.
Okay, so a PIT maneuver, for those who aren't familiar, is a pursuit intervention technique,
Right.
which is where a pursuing car can force a fleeing car to abruptly turn sideways, causing the driver to lose control and stop.
Right.
And they found a 9mm handgun inside his car.
Yeah. So just to recap, at this point, 8 people were killed.
Yeah.
7 women and 1 man, and 1 man was injured.
Right.
6 of the deceased were of Asian descent, 4 at Piedmont Road and 2 in Cherokee County.
Right.
The other 2 victims were white, a man and a woman, and the injured survivor is Hispanic. And then the South Korean Foreign Affairs Ministry also later confirmed that 4 of the deceased were of Korean ethnicity, and 1 was a South Korean citizen.
Okay.
So, it's important to kind of name the victims here.
Yeah.
Because these are the people whose lives were tragically cut short.
Yeah.
So at Young's Asian Massage, you had Delana Ashley, Jan Gonzalez, Xiaoji Tandayu Feng, and Paul Andre Michels. At Gold Spa, there was Hyunjan Grant Suncha Kim and Soon Chung Park. And then at Aromatherapy Spa, there was Young Ayu.
It's just heartbreaking to think
It
about.
really is. And, just thinking about their families and their loved ones, it's unfathomable the pain that they must be going through.
Yeah, so we've talked about the events,
Yeah.
how they unfolded,
Right.
and the victims, and I think now it's time to kind of really unpack,
Yeah.
who is responsible for this and what we know about him and why he did it.
Right, because I think that's the biggest question that everyone has. It's like, why did this happen?
Why? Why did he do
Yes. Yeah. So Robert Aaron Long was 21 years old. He was from Woodstock, Georgia.
that? Okay.
Grew up in a pretty conservative community.
Oh.
Graduated high school in 2017.
Mm.
Briefly attended the University of North Georgia.
Okay.
He was a hunter. He was actively involved in his Southern Baptist congregation.
Okay.
And Sheriff Reynolds said that he had no prior interactions with law enforcement.
So, on the surface, it seems like he came from a relatively, quote unquote, normal background.
Right.
Um, but I know that he had spent some time at an evangelical treatment facility called Hope Quest.
Yes.
And it was actually near the location of the first shooting.
Right.
And he was there for what he described as sex addiction.
Right. And this is where things start to get a little murky
Okay.
because his roommate from a halfway house
All right.
said that Long felt really conflicted and tortured by his sex addiction
Hmm.
because of his religious beliefs.
Okay.
And he even admitted to relapsing at massage parlors. So, that right there is pretty significant information,
Yeah.
because it suggests that there may have been this internal struggle going on within him
Right.
between his, religious beliefs and his urges.
Yeah. I mean, it's really hard to understand what was going on in his head,
Absolutely.
But we also know that his parents evicted him from their home the night before the shootings.
Yes.
And they were concerned about his sex addiction
Right.
and his frequent use of pornography.
Yeah, and apparently he was really emotional
Oh, wow.
after being asked to leave.
So you've got this really volatile mix of, internal struggle and then this external
Rejection.
rejection
Yeah.
from his family.
And it's interesting because when he was questioned by police, Long said that his actions were motivated by this sex addiction
Mm.
and his desire to eliminate the temptation posed by the spas.
So he framed it as he was trying to do something good.
Yeah, like he was trying to help people who were also struggling with sex addiction. He even said that he considered suicide, but then decided to target these businesses instead.
So it was almost like he was trying to save other people.
Yeah, it's a really distorted way of thinking,
Yeah.
but that seems to be what was going on in his mind.
And we know that he was an active member of Crabapple First Baptist Church.
Right.
And they actually removed their Facebook page, including photos of Long after the shooting, which kind of shows how, shocking and upsetting this was even for his own church community.
Right. And, this connection to a religious community, I think it adds another layer of complexity to trying to understand his mindset.
Right.
Because you have to think about the context in which he was viewing his struggles.
Right.
Ruth Graham from the New York Times wrote about Long's fixation on sexual temptation.
Okay.
And she said that it can lead to despair for people who feel like they're failing to adhere to strict religious ideals
Alrighty.
about sex and lust.
And sociologist Samuel Perry added to that, saying that the church's confusing sex rhetoric could lead to feelings of desperation regarding perceived sex addiction.
Right.
And a belief that extreme measures are necessary to stop it.
And, it's important to point out that sex addiction isn't actually recognized as a formal diagnosis by the American Psychological Association. In the DSM-5, which is the standard classification of mental disorders used by mental health professionals in the U.S.
Okay.
The World Health Organization's ICD-10, which is another international classification, it does include excessive sexual drive as a compulsive behavior,
Right.
but not as an addiction in the traditional sense of substance dependence.
Okay.
So there's debate about whether sex addiction is even a real thing, and experts like psychologist David J. Lay and neuroscientist Nicole Praz have pointed out that there are differences between what's termed sex addiction and other forms of addiction,
Okay.
particularly in terms of neurobiological response, so it's not as clear-cut as saying oh, this person is addicted to sex the same way that someone might be addicted to alcohol or drugs.
Right. And psychotherapist Robert Weiss, who does diagnose individuals with sexual addiction. He expressed skepticism about Long's self-diagnosis
Okay.
and pointed out that people with sex addiction are typically nonviolent.
Right.
So
That's a really important point, I think,
Yeah.
because it really calls into question the validity of Long's claim that
Oh.
he was only motivated by a sex addiction.
Right. And that brings us to, this really important question
Right.
of motive
Of motive.
and whether this was a hate crime.
Right.
And 6 of the victims were Asian women.
Right.
And these attacks happened at a time when there was a huge rise in anti-Asian hate crimes
Right.
during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Absolutely. And, this is where things get really complicated.
Right.
Because you have Long saying, he wasn't motivated by race. He was just targeting establishments that he had frequented
Okay.
because of his sex addiction. But the choice of these specific establishments staffed largely by Asian women
Right.
can't be separated from the larger societal context
Right.
of the hypersexualization and fetishization of Asian women.
Right.
That's been happening for centuries
Right.
in this country.
So even if he's saying it wasn't racially motivated,
Right.
how can
How can
we...
you separate those two things?
Exactly.
It's impossible.
Yeah, it's impossible.
And, there's this long history
Right.
of the fetishization and sexualization of Asian women in the United States.
Right.
And it's something that a lot of people in the community have talked about,
Right.
and how it makes them feel vulnerable and targeted.
Right.
So, even if Long wasn't consciously thinking, I'm going to target Asian women because I hate them,
Right.
he was still subconsciously influenced by those stereotypes
Right.
and those biases.
Yeah, and that to me is really at the heart of what makes this...
So difficult and complex, because even if he's saying those words, you can't.
You can't erase the history.
Right.
You can't erase the context in which this happened.
Right.
And you can't erase the impact that it's had.
Exactly. So I know that there were, legal proceedings following these events.
Right.
And Long was initially charged with 8 counts of murder and 1 count of aggravated assault.
Right. And he confessed to the killings while he was in custody.
Okay. And then in Fulton County, the grand jury issued a 19-count indictment.
Okay.
And I think it's helpful for our listeners to kind of understand what some of those things mean.
Yeah.
Because I know
Because there's a lot of legal jargon in there.
it gets really complicated.
Yeah.
So murder is obviously the unlawful killing of another person,
Right.
but with malice aforethought.
Right.
Felony murder is when someone dies during the commission of another felony.
Right.
So even if the intent wasn't to kill.
Aggravated assault is an attack with intent to injure or kill,
Mm.
often with a deadly weapon.
Right.
And then this indictment included domestic terrorism,
Right.
which is acts dangerous to human life that are intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population.
Right.
Or influence government policy through mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping.
And that's a really important charge, I think, because it recognizes the wider impact of Long's actions.
Right.
This wasn't just a crime against individuals.
Right.
This was a crime against a whole community.
Right. And the district attorney announced plans to seek the death penalty.
Right.
And hate crime enhancements.
Which means that they would argue that the crimes were motivated by bias.
Right.
And that would make the sentences even harsher.
Okay.
And then in Cherokee County, the grand jury handed down a 23-count indictment
Okay.
with charges including malice murder,
Right.
which is an intentional killing with ill will or hatred.
Mm.
Felony murder, again relating to death during the commission of another felony.
Right.
Attempted murder.
Right.
And aggravated assault.
Yeah.
So a lot of overlap there
Yeah.
between the two jurisdictions.
So Long pleaded guilty to the Cherokee County charges,
Right.
and he was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences
Right.
without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 35 years.
Wow.
And it's important to note that the Cherokee County District Attorney said that investigators found no evidence of racial bias in their jurisdiction.
Right.
But the Fulton County prosecutor said they were still going to seek the death penalty.
Right.
And they designated the Piedmont Road shootings as a hate crime based on race and gender.
Yeah, so, this just highlights the complexity of
Right.
this case and how there are different legal standards
Right.
and interpretations across jurisdictions.
Right.
And also, just the ongoing debate
Right.
surrounding the motivations behind the attacks.
Yeah. So Long pleaded not guilty to the Fulton County charges.
Right.
So that case is still ongoing. But there were obviously a lot of reactions
Yeah.
to this event.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this event really shook the nation.
Yeah.
And the world, really.
And President Biden, he ordered flags to be flown at half-mast
Mm-hmm.
to honor the victims.
Mm-hmm.
And he and Vice President Harris traveled to Atlanta to meet with Asian American community leaders.
Yeah, they wanted to offer their support and hear their concerns.
Right.
And it was really important for them to do that because
Yeah.
it showed the Asian American community that the government was taking this seriously.
And then Biden gave a speech condemning hate crimes against Asian Americans
Right.
and voiced his support for the proposed COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act.
Which was specifically aimed at making it easier to investigate and prosecute anti-Asian hate incidents.
And the South Korean government, they also responded,
Yeah.
which showed the international impact of this tragedy.
Right.
Their foreign minister and national defense minister held a press conference with their U.S. counterparts. And the South Korean Foreign Ministry issued a statement
Yeah.
addressing the shooting and expressing hope for U.S. anti-hate crime efforts.
So this really shows that this wasn't just an American issue.
Right.
This was something that was being felt
Around the world.
around the world.
And then there was the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act,
Right.
which passed with bipartisan support.
Yeah, that was a really big deal
Yeah.
because it showed that both Democrats and Republicans were united in condemning anti-Asian hate. And it gave the Justice Department more power to review COVID-19 related hate crimes and to establish an online database
Okay.
for tracking these incidents.
So that sounds like a really positive step.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a step in the right direction.
Right.
It's not a solution,
Right.
but it's a start.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that this tragedy really amplified the anxieties that were already there
Yeah,
in the Asian American community about anti-Asian sentiment and violence.
absolutely.
And sociologist Nancy Wang Yuen, she called the shootings part of a nationwide pattern of Asian women being targeted.
Right.
And this was because of racism and sexism.
Yeah, and she pointed out that Asian women are often hypersexualized in American culture.
Right.
And that this makes them more vulnerable to violence.
And then Stop Asian Hate, which is a coalition addressing anti-Asian hate and discrimination.
Right.
They reported almost 11,000 attacks
Wow.
against Asian Americans.
That's a staggering number.
Yeah.
And it just shows how widespread this problem is.
Yeah. And these attacks happened between March 2020 and December 2021.
Right. So during the pandemic,
Right.
when anti-Asian sentiment was already really high.
And the FBI, they also reported a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes starting in 2019. So this is a trend that was happening even before the pandemic.
Right.
But the pandemic definitely made it worse.
Yeah, it's like it gave people an excuse to act on their prejudices.
And there were a number of Asian American politicians who spoke out about this.
Yeah.
Marilyn Strickland and Bean Gwynn. They emphasized the need to address violence against Asian Americans and question the dismissal of racial motives.
Right, because even if Long himself wasn't consciously motivated by race, the fact that he targeted Asian-owned businesses speaks volumes.
Yeah, it can't be ignored. And Jeremy Lin, he accused Donald Trump's rhetoric about the Chinese virus
Right.
of inciting hatred.
Yeah, and a lot of other athletes and public figures also spoke out about this.
Right.
They were saying that words have power. And that Trump's rhetoric had contributed to a climate of fear and hostility towards Asian Americans.
And the coverage of this in South Korea was really extensive.
Yeah.
And a lot of outlets there called on American society to confront what they called the serious reality of racial bullying and hate crimes.
And I think it's interesting that there was some criticism of mainstream American media's coverage compared to Korean language media. Because Korean language media tended to focus more on the victims and their stories and potential racial motivations. While American media sometimes seemed to focus more on the shooter and his background and kind of downplayed the possibility of racial bias.
And this wasn't just an issue in the United States.
Right.
Groups in Canada also condemned the shootings.
Yeah.
And the Canadian House of Commons passed a motion condemning the shootings and calling for action to combat anti-Asian hate in Canada.
So this was a global issue.
It really was.
And it sparked conversations about racism and xenophobia all over the world.
The shootings also sparked concern among advocates for sex workers.
Right.
They were worried about increased stigma and violence.
Yeah.
Fueled by anti-sex work ideology.
And Tracy Kwan, who's an Asian American and a former sex worker, she said that it was difficult to separate race and sex as motives in this tragedy.
Yeah. And she said that she had experienced more prejudice related to her work in the sex industry
Yeah.
than to her race.
Which I think is a really important point.
Yeah, it is.
Because it shows that there are all these different layers
Right.
of oppression and marginalization
Right.
that are at play here.
And owners and employees of Asian-owned businesses across the U.S. reported increased fear for their safety after the shootings.
Yeah, it's understandable.
Yeah.
You know, they were afraid that they might be targeted next.
And this tragedy also sparked a debate about hate crimes
Right.
and how they're defined and how data is collected.
Because a lot of people felt like the current system wasn't adequate. You know,
Right.
they felt like a lot of hate crimes were going unreported
Right.
and that the data wasn't being collected accurately. So it was hard to get a true sense of the scope of the problem.
And the NYPD, they increased security in Asian American communities in New York City
Yeah.
after the shootings.
As a precaution. Which, you know, is understandable, but it also raises questions about,
Right.
you know, racial profiling and over-policing of
Right.
certain communities.
And a lot of people were skeptical
Yeah,
of Long's claim that he wasn't racially motivated.
absolutely.
And politicians like Bean Green,
Right.
she pointed out that even if he was targeting women, that could still be considered a hate crime
Right.
if they were targeted based on their gender.
Exactly. And President Biden, during his visit to Atlanta,
Yeah.
he actually condemned the attacks as a hate crime, which I think was a really powerful statement.
Yeah.
You know, it showed